Yo, what's going on everybody, it's FreakyDude99 and welcome back to another Destiny 2 Endgame build video. This time I'm returning with a fantastic Prismatic Hunter build utilizing Ex Diris and the Mothkeeper's wraps. This is a build that was very popular about last year, and with the recent buffs to Ex Diris and its moth generation and damage, I thought it was a perfect time to bring it back as it absolutely devastates Expert Onslaught Salvation and destroys going into Master Nightfalls. I'm going to be using this build when Grandmasters drop next week, and it's a perfect time to jump in, throw down some moths, and have a blast with everything that Prismatic offers and everything you can do with this build this season. So of course, with all my builds, there's going to be a picture at the end of the video along with a dim link in the description for easy copying. Without further ado, let's jump into the build. Starting out with the build, we have the Prismatic subclass and we are rocking the Silence and Squall super. This is a beautiful super that is sure to crowd control any battlefield that you throw it down on, freezing enemies and slowing them, shattering them, and being able to take out massive waves of enemy with ease. Not only that, but it is a stasis super. When paired along with Faceted Purpose, you get Frost Armor whenever picking up an Orb of Power. Frost Armor is in with our artifact this season, allowing us to get some extra bonuses from there, so rocking the stasis super means that we can get the Frost Armor and benefit from those seasonal artifact perks. Moving forward, we are grabbing Gambler's Dodge, which when we dodge near enemies, we're going to be refunding our melee just to keep a solid ability loop because we are using the Snare Bomb melee. Snare Bomb, we throw it down and it weakens enemies. Weakening enemies also synergizes with the seasonal artifact, allowing us to grant Devour on ourselves. So we want to be able to weaken lots of enemies, groups of enemies, do a dodge and throw down another weaken on enemies if need be. We are able to weaken enemies with our grenade launchers, but only more powerful combatants, but with Snare Bomb, we can weaken groups of enemies in Expert Onslaught Salvation, take them all out, grant Devour on ourselves, and gain that increased grenade ability regen. Speaking of our grenade, it doesn't matter what we pick here because we are getting a Moth Cage grenade from our Mothkeeper's wraps, which when we throw it, it's going to spit out into 2 moths, and it'll either be 2 Void Moths granting us Void Overshield, or an Arc Moth that will go towards an enemy and explode on them, which also blinds them. This blind means we can actually stun unstoppable champions and have a built-in stun mechanic for ourselves, allowing us to have a bit more flexibility in what we want to build and what we want to bring to our weapons. Moving forward to our aspects, we are grabbing Winter's Shroud, which grants us 3 fragment slots and allows us to dodge near enemies and slow them. This slow also makes it so we have increased class ability regen, and it allows us to dodge and throw out more snare bombs. Add to that, we are also using Gunpowder Gamble, so whenever we defeat targets with abilities, elemental debuff damage, or solar weapons, we charge up this solar explosive that takes over our grenade. We can throw this out, stun unstoppable champions, and cause massive amounts of solar damage on the field, and it's really fun to build with this because we are releasing tons of moths, which gets tons of takedowns for us. Add to that, our moths are also going to be applying Jolt, which means we can stun overload champions and get increased stacks for our Gunpowder Gamble, allowing us to throw it out even more. We are getting Jolt for our moth grenade through the Facet of Dominance, which makes it so our arc grenades jolt targets. Our Moth Cage actually releases an arc or a void moth, but it does technically count as an arc grenade, which means whenever those moths hit an enemy, they're going to be jolting them, and that jolt will spread to nearby enemies, which means we can also stun overload champions and unstoppable champions with just 1 grenade. This means that the only champions we have to worry about is going to be barrier champions, but with weapons we can easily take care of them. Moving over to more fragments, we are also grabbing Facet of Awakening, so whenever we rapidly defeat targets with light or darkness damage or super final blows, we're going to generate an elemental pickup. With all of our arc takedowns from our moths, we are generating ionic traces. With all of our Gunpowder Gamble takedowns, we're generating fire sprites. And with our Silence and Squall, we are generating stasis shards, so with these we are getting an increased amount of ability regen for our grenade, our melee, and just everything from ionic traces, meaning that we have a really healthy loop of abilities to throw out onto the battlefield. We always have our moth grenades up, we always have our snare bomb up, and we can always dodge to get another snare bomb back. Forward from that, we are grabbing Facet of Protection, so while surrounded by combatants, we are getting more resistant to incoming damage, and while Transcendent this effect is increased, we're always surrounded by enemies in Onslaught and Master Nightfalls, which means this benefits us hugely. Forward from that, we are grabbing Facet of Balance, so rapidly defeating targets with light damage grants us melee energy, giving us more and more snare bombs to throw out onto the field, and rapidly defeating targets with darkness damage grants us grenade energy. We don't have a whole lot of darkness damage except for our Silence and Squall, but that's not a worry because of all of our armor mods are actually going to be generating a lot of grenade energy for us. As previously mentioned, we are grabbing Facet of Purpose, so whenever we pick up an Orb of Power, we're granting ourselves Frost Armor, which gives us increased damage resistance depending on the amount of stacks we have. We are generating tons of orbs with this build, so we have tons of stacks available to us. And finally, we are grabbing Facet of Sacrifice. So while we have an Arc Solar or Void buff, ability Final Blows grant bonus Darkness Transcendence energy. This is the only Transcendence energy that we really have trouble generating, but because we have Amplified constantly going and Void Overshield constantly going, it means that we get a lot of Darkness Transcendence energy, and we can pop our Prismatic whenever we need to be able to. Now that is going to do it for the subclass, moving on to those weapons. Starting out with the weapons, we have our main exotic weapon of choice, which is going to be Ex Diris. It received a pretty substantial buff with this recent episode, and it allows it to actually generate moths just by damaging enemies. This means that you can just fire out round after round, they'll explode out into the moths, and it means you can actually stun unstoppable champions just by using Ex Diris. Along with that, because of these seasonal artifact perks, we can actually stun overload champions with Ex Diris as well, meaning that this weapon can stun 2 champions in one, along with our grenade. Plus, hopefully you do have the catalyst for this because it means that the weapon enrages faster while you're amplified, and final blows with the weapon do make you amplified, just giving you a bit of more of increased movement speed and jump speed for whenever you're rushing through Vanguard ops or content like that. Now for weapons to pair alongside Ex Diris, you do need to make sure that you are dealing with barrier champions whenever they come up. With the seasonal artifact, we have anti-barrier scout rifles and anti-barrier shotguns. You can technically run double special, although it will be a little dicey, and it means that you need to run something like a machine gun in your heavy slot. Ultimately, what I do recommend is that you run a void weapon in your heavy slot, something like Edge Transit or Hammerhead, or any of the number of void heavy weapons out there, just so you can benefit from other stuff in the artifact that we'll go over later. And then in your primary slot, if you want to run something like a shotgun, you totally can, it just means you have to get a little bit more up close and personal. If you're going into stuff like Master Nightfalls or Grandmaster Nightfalls, I will recommend that you pull out one of your favorite scout rifles and slot it in. Something to give you a little bit more range to stay back, throw out moths, and have a much easier time than having to run in and get a shotgun shot off when there is constant damage being fired at you and you can potentially be one shot in stuff like GMs. Now that's going to do it for the weapons, moving on to the artifact perks. Now moving on to the artifact mods, we're grabbing 3 perks in the first column to deal with any champions that we come across. Of course, you want to grab something like Overload Breachload Grenade Launcher, which allows you to actually stun overload champions with our Ex Diris, but it also makes sure that it is overcharged, which means it receives a 25% damage buff when you're an expert or higher content, which you're really going to want to have. You also want to make sure that you have anti-barrier scout rifle and usually anti-barrier shotgun, that way you can switch around depending on what you're using. For the second column, we're going to be grabbing Killing Breeze, so rapid weapon final blows are going to be granting us a bonus to mobility. This means that with all of our takedowns, we are getting a little bit buff to our mobility, which means that we can actually use our dodge a lot more. And it also means that weapon final blows with the Dark Aether Reaper origin trait count as more than 1, in case you're using weapons from this season. Add to that, we are grabbing Fell the Revenant, so we deal increased weapon damage to Scorn, and depending on how many Shadestalker armor pieces we have equipped, we gain increase to that bonus damage. This is just a little buff depending on if we are actually dealing with Scorn, which usually you are if you're jumping into something like Expert Onslaught. Moving forward to third column, we are grabbing Power from Pain, so rapid final blows against weakened combatants will grant us Devour. This means that we can throw down a snare bomb in a group of enemies, fire off an Ex Diris shot to blow them all up, and then boom, we have Devour, so any further takedowns will give us a little burst of health and gain us some grenade energy to go along with it. This means that we can throw out a lot more moths and survive a lot more when we're in things like Expert Onslaught, where there's just constant damage coming at us. We are also using Trace Evidence, so rapid precision hits or rapid final blows on targets affected by Jolt or Blind will generate ionic traces. This just increases the amount of ionic traces that we are actually generating because our moths are going to be blinding enemies and going to be jolting them whenever we throw them through the grenade. This just means that more ionic traces give us more ability energy to throw more moths and more snare bombs. And we are also using Total Carnage, so after finishing a powerful combatant we gain temporary damage resistance, and if we have some Shadestalker armor pieces equipped, we gain a little burst of health and even more damage resistance. Moving forward to third column, we are grabbing Armor of Aramis, so while Frost Armor is active, taking critical damage from combatants cause you to emit a freezing burst. We have Frost Armor from Orbs of Power and our Silence and Squall Super interacting with Facet of Purpose, so we are covered there. And we are also grabbing Concussive Reload, so using a grenade launcher to damage a boss, damage a champion, or break combatant shields will weaken them. This means that we can fire off Ex Diris everywhere and weaken a whole bunch of enemies and take them out with all the moths generated. Finally, for fifth column, we are grabbing Supernova, so picking up a Void Breach causes our next source of void damage to create a large weakening pulse. This is why we want to have a Void Heavy weapon so we actually benefit from this, and we're also generating Void Breaches through our Snare Bomb takedowns, as well as when we have the boost going on our Power from Pain, which makes it so rapidly defeating weakened combatants will spawn a Void Breach. Add to that, we are also using Conductive Cosmic Crystal, so our arc abilities, void abilities, and weapons with the Dark Ether origin trait do bonus damage to targets that are affected by a stasis debuff. This means that we can go in, do a dodge, slow enemies, and take them down even quicker with our moth grenades, as well as when we throw out our Silence and Squall, we can throw out a bunch of more moths that gain bonus damage. For tonics that you want to run, I would recommend using the Refined Tonic of Weakening Void, which boosts the Power from Pain, which makes it so rapidly defeating weakened combatants spawns a Void Breach, and it boosts Concussive Reload, which makes it so using grenade launchers to damage bosses, champions, or break combatant shield automatically reload your stowed weapons. Ex Diris doesn't need to reload ever, but it means that you never have to reload for your primary and your heavy weapon. Starting out with the armor and our helmet, we are going to be grabbing a Ashes to Asset, so we gain bonus super energy on our grenade takedowns. We're constantly throwing out moth grenades, so those are generating tons of takedowns for us, along with them jolting, which just adds on a lot of extra damage. We're also using Heavy Ammo Finder, so we have an increased chop chance of heavy ammo when using a primary weapon. This just means we can actually use our heavy ammo weapon if we need to. And then we are also grabbing an Arc Siphon, so we generate Orbs of Power on all of our Ex Diris takedowns, which we get a lot of. Quickly touching on stat focusing, we are going Resilience first for that 30% damage reduction at tier 10. This is near vital when you're in stuff like Expert Onslaught Salvation and Master or Grandmaster Nightfalls, as you will most likely get one shot without it. We're also focusing into Discipline second, so we have a lower cooldown on our moth grenades, allowing us to throw out a lot more of them if need be. And then finally, we are bumping up mobility to as high as possible. That way we can dodge as many times as we need and get our snare bomb back for more weakening enemies and getting Devour for ourselves. Down to the gauntlets, we have our Moth Keeper's Wraps, which come with the exotic intrinsic trait Winged Eclipse. This makes it so our grenade becomes a cage of loyal moths that release on impact and fly towards the nearest target or ally. If they reach a target, they detonate in a blinding explosion, and if they reach an ally, the moths grant your ally a void overshield. This means that if you're in danger, you can throw a moth at your feet, gain an instant void overshield, or just toss them over at enemies to blind the heck out of them. This also gives you 2 grenade charges, which means you can throw out 2 sets of moths onto the battlefield to cause massive amounts of jolting and blinding. This also means that if you have 1 charge of your grenade already going, you have an increased grenade recharge rate on that second grenade charge. This means that if you hold on to one grenade charge, it allows you to throw out more consistent grenades out, and if you're ever in danger, you can pop that second grenade if need be. For the actual armor, we are grabbing firepower, so our grenade final blows actually create orbs of power with all of the damage they're doing. Extra orbs means more supers for us, and more healing and more everything. We're also grabbing double impact induction, so causing damage with our powered melee attack reduces our grenade cooldown, allowing us to get a lot more moths onto the field. Down to the chest piece, we are grabbing a double elemental resistance to match whatever the current threat modifier is. This means that if you have an arc threat going on your activity, you want to match it to a double arc resistance to match that and get increased damage resistance against what's dealing the most damage, and then a third elemental resistance to balance the damage types that are being dealt to you that you don't have resistance against. So if you have a double arc resistance, you can run a void resistance alongside that if you find you're dealing with Scorn or something which happen to have a lot of void damage on them. Down to the legs, we are grabbing a double arc weapon surge, so while we have an armor charge, we have a 17% increased weapon damage to our arc weapons, allowing Ex Diris to deal a lot more damage and be used to take down champions and bosses a lot quicker. Add to that, we are also using recuperation, so whenever we pick up an orb of power, we're getting a burst of healing, which saves you a whole heck of a lot of times, because you can generate a ton of orbs with this build, and you can go pick up an orb of power and save yourself from almost going down. Finally, for our class item, we are grabbing double bomber, so whenever we use our class ability, we are gaining some grenade energy alongside that, giving us more moths to throw out, and we're also using Reaper, so whenever we do our dodge, we are generating an orb of power on our next weapon final blow. More orbs mean more super, more healing, more everything that we can do. Now that is going to do it for the build. Now the Moth build has been one of my favorites, and with Prismatic and Ex Diris getting this buff, it's a perfect time to bring it back and lay waste to things like Expert Onslaught Salvation and Master Nightfalls, as well as GMs when those eventually drop next week, as it deals so much damage, provides so much survivability, and just lays waste to anything in front of you. With us being able to stun overloads and unstoppables with a single grenade or Ex Diris, it means that we can just absolutely decimate any activity that we step into, and the only thing we have to worry about is barrier champions, which gets covered by a shotgun or scout rifle, which are really easy to come by. This means that we are a constant force of nature for whatever fire team that we're jumping in with, because it also means that we're weakening pretty much every enemy along the way, and we're also giving them void overshield for increased survivability, meaning that any teammate is going to be happy to have you, because we are blinding and jolting all these enemies, meaning that they can't damage us. When they're blinded, they get jolted, so we gain ionic traces for more ability regen, and we just stun overload champions and everything along the way. This build has honestly just been such a blast to play around with, and I've been able to absolutely slaughter through Expert Onslaught Salvation with no trouble whatsoever, and even jumping into stuff like Master Nightfalls, it has been a breeze as we just throw out so many moths, blind everything, and just have such a fun time doing it. So, of course, if you need a picture of this build, there's going to be one on screen for easy copying, along with a dim link and a mobalytics link in the description below if you'd like to copy from there. So, be sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already to not miss out on any future build videos, as well as leave a like and a comment if you enjoyed this video as well. I love to see what you guys have to say down there, and I always try to respond to every single comment on your suggestions or future improvements for these builds. It's always so much fun just engaging with you guys as a community and developing such a positive environment in the comments and on this channel. Other than that, I've been FreakyDude99, and we'll see you in the next video. Peace out.